Installment in our lecture series for the principles of microeconomics here at Rutgers University. And in this video lecture series, in this particular video lecture, what I'm going to do is just to do a very brief overview of game theory and give you an example of what a payoff matrix looks like and how to determine if somebody has a dominant strategy and if there's a Nash equilibrium in the particular game that we're talking about. So we have two participants in this. We're looking at firm A, and firm B. And they have two strategies that they can engage in. Both of them can either advertise or not advertise. So what we want to take a look at is what is the best strategy for each firm dependent upon the strategy of their opponent or their competitor in the marketplace. So let's take a look at how A should react to B's strategy. So we'll take a look at, for example, if B decides to advertise, what is A's best strategy? Well, if B does not advertise and A does not advertise, A makes $50,000 in profits. Okay? And if B continues to not advertise but A advertises, we see that A will make $75,000 in profit. So A is better off to advertise when B does not advertise. Why? Because their profits are $75,000 when they do advertise versus $50,000 when they don't advertise. So when B does not advertise, the best thing for A to do is to advertise because their profits are higher. Now let's take a look at what happens if B takes the alternate strategy. If B decides to advertise. If B decides to advertise and A does not advertise, we see that A's profits they actually lose money. They are losing $25,000. So if B is to advertise and A doesn't advertise, A will lose $25,000. But if B advertises and A decides to advertise, their profits will be $10,000. So again, A is better off advertising because if B advertises and A advertises, the profits for company A will equal to $10,000 versus losing $25,000 if they don't advertise. So we see here that regardless of what B's strategy is, if B's strategy is to advertise or not advertise, A's best strategy is to advertise. So therefore, advertise is the dominant strategy for A. They are always better off, regardless of what B does, by advertising. Now let's take a look at the same thing for B and take a look at what's their best strategy for A's different strategies. So if A is not advertising, what are the two potential strategies for B and what are the outcomes for that? All right, so if A is not advertising and if B doesn't advertise, B has profits of $50,000. But if they switch to advertise when A doesn't advertise, their profits increase to $75,000. So if A strategy is don't advertise, B is better off by advertising because their profits increase to $75,000 opposed to $50,000 when they don't advertise. Now let's take a look at the other strategy that A might be involved in. A may advertise. So let's take a look at the outcomes for the two strategies for B. So if A is advertising and B decides to not to advertise, we can see that the profits of B is going to be equal to losses. They are going to lose $25,000 if they don't advertise when A advertises. If they switch to advertise, the advertise strategy while A is advertising, we see that their profits are equal to $10,000. So you can see, regardless of what A strategy is, B, I'm sorry, B is always better off advertising, because if A is advertising and B advertises, their profits will be equal to $10,000 versus $25,000 if they don't advertise. And if A doesn't advertise and B advertises, profits will be equal to $75,000 versus $50,000 if they don't advertise. So advertise is a dominant strategy for B. So for A and B, advertise is a dominant strategy. Well, let's take a look at this. Is there a Nash equilibrium? A Nash equilibrium is just like any other equilibrium. It is when there is no incentive for either party to deviate from a particular strategy. So if we assume advertise and advertise, we will see that the bottom quadrant here is where they intersect. Is there any incentive for either party to deviate from advertise? All right, let's take a look at B. If B advertises and A advertises and B decides not to advertise, what's going to occur? Their profits are going to go from $10,000 to losses of $25,000. So B has no incentive to deviate from advertise. Let's look at the same thing for A. If we're in this bottom quadrant here of advertise, and A decides to not advertise, what happens to their profits? Their profits were $10,000, but when they switch to don't advertise, they end up with $25,000 in losses. So if either party, B or B, if we end up in this advertise situation, neither party has an incentive to deviate from this. So in this instance here, advertise is a Nash equilibrium because neither party has any incentive to deviate. Now, what would be the best solution as a whole for this industry? These are the only two firms. And the best solution is to take a look at what maximizes the profits of the entire industry. So if we do advertise, we see that profits are equal to 10,000 and 10,000. Total profits are equal to 20,000. All right. If we have advertise for B and don't advertise for A, we see that total profits are equal to 75,000 minus 25,000, 50,000. Same thing if we do don't advertise for B and advertise for A. Total profits are equal to 75,000 minus 25,000, 50,000. And then if we have a strategy of don't advertise for both parties, what is the total profits of the industry? 50,000 and 50,000, it's 100,000. So don't advertise and don't advertise is the optimal strategy for the entire industry. Industry profits are maximized by don't advertise. But if both parties agree to not advertise, what do you think will occur? Are there any incentives for the parties to cheat on the agreement? And the answer is yes. If, for example, B and A get together and agree, we won't advertise, is there an incentive for B to lie and cheat and say they're not going to advertise and advertise? Yes, they are, because if you look at this, if they keep to the agreement, they will make $50,000 a year. If they cheat and tell A that they're going to forego advertising and advertise anyway, that causes their profits to jump to $75,000. So B has an incentive to cheat, even if they've come to an agreement that both parties won't advertise. And the same holds for A. If A and B agree that they won't advertise, does A have an incentive to cheat? Yes. Because if A keeps to the agreement, profits will be equal to 50,000. But if they lie or cheat on this agreement and agree with B that they're not going to advertise and advertise anyway, their profits should go up to $75,000. So both parties have an incentive to cheat. So that's one thing I want to point out to you about the Nash equilibrium. When we talked about equilibrium before, it was the most efficient outcome in a marketplace, that there was the best allocation of resources, etc. A Nash equilibrium, and don't think a Nash equilibrium means the same. And it's a Nash equilibrium in respect that there's no incentive for either party to deviate from that particular strategy. In this case, advertise. There's no incentive for them to deviate. It is not the optimal outcome for the entire industry. The optimal outcome for the entire industry is for both parties to agree to not advertise. That way, industry profits will be equal to $10,000 versus $50,000 and $20,000 for all the other potential outcomes. So in order for this to hold, there has to be some kind of sanction that is held against the cheating party. So they'd have to agree, for example, don't advertise, that both parties won't advertise, and that if the cheating party would have to reimburse the non-cheating party for a sum of money, and that sum of money would have to be equivalent to an amount that would cause them to have no incentive to cheat. For example, if the parties were to agree that the cheating party would have to pay the non-cheating party $50,000 or $75,000, that would eliminate the incentive to cheat, because even if it was set at, for example, $26,000, all right, if it was set at $26,000, B would not be incentivized to cheat, because if they cheated, what would happen? They would get profits of $75,000, but then they'd have to pay their opponent $26,000 because they cheated, and that would lower their profits down to $49,000. So just realize that number one, I want you to realize, like I said, we're not talking about, this is a game theory course, but I wanted to just give you a very basic background on a few notions. For example, what a payoff matrix is, what are the different strategies for individuals involved in the game, to what a dominant strategy is, and what a Nash equilibrium is, and also to illustrate to you that a Nash equilibrium does not provide the optimal, does not necessarily provide the optimal outcome for the parties as a whole, that this does not maximize the profits of the industry as a whole.